Hi guys, welcome back. It's Social History Sunday. Um, I'm picking up the schedule properly again. Right, so we've talked about pastimes and sports and activities of the medieval era in England before. And I thought we'd have another look, but instead of the outdoor activities like football and hunting and archery and things like that, we'd mainly look at some of the more popular indoor activities, the indoor games that were played. Now, games during the medieval period, most of the indoor games were played during the winter. It was, winter in England is miserable at the best of times. So lots of games were played indoors, and they were played by all strata of society, from the noblest monarch nobility all the way down to the peasants at the bottom. Lots of different games played. So the first one we'll look at some board games. Mostly played by nobility and the clergy, we have chess. Now chess, as played in the 13th century, is the same, well, the version we play today has its roots in the 13th century. Now, contrary to popular belief, the game that we play today is not the same game of chess as was developed in the 3rd century BCE by either the Persians or the Indians, depending on which origin story you prefer to follow. Yes, they invented chess. I personally prefer the Persian origin story, but the Indian one has equal validity, the Asian one has equal validity. But there are lots of other variations of the game as well. There's a Chinese variation of the game. There is even a Scandinavian variation which is played on, instead of using the 8 by 8 square board, it's played on a 6 by 8 square board, and you lose the two end pieces from each side. For instance, like they don't have the castles and the protecting pawn on each end of the row of pieces. However, that's not the one we're interested in. At the end of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th century, chess was played quite extensively, but the French and the English nobility and royalty decided that they wanted a game which more accurately reflected their way of life. So they redesigned some of the movement aspects of the game. They redesigned some of the pieces of the game, and they renamed them. And as a result, the variation which came into popular
Battery 97%.
popular use in the 13th century, which is the same version we play today, sees the advent of kings, queens, bishops, knights and castles, completely different to the original. Whether that's true or not, I don't know whether there's enough evidence to prove it one way or another, but that's the way the documentation seems to pan out. The other game we're looking at is backgammon. Again, this is another game which is different to the game we play today. Today's modern version of backgammon apparently only dates back to about the 17th century, the 1700s, 17th century, yeah. Completely different to the original game. The modern game is played on 24 spikes, and the object is to get your pieces around the board as quickly as possible, playing such a rapid game that your component becomes confused and allows you to get your pieces off the board before he gets his off the board. Now, the original game apparently was completely different to that, and backgammon scholars, there's an argument to say that the nearest version that everybody knows about comes from the 13th century, and it's the Anglo-Scottish version, which was called Irish or Irishman. And there are scholars who say that's the nearest to the original game as anybody can figure. Now, the game was played on 20 or 22 spikes, and the object wasn't to get your pieces off the board, so much as it was to capture your opponent's pieces. And at the end of the game, the person with the most pieces off the board won. So you were getting your pieces off the board, but you were winning by stopping your opponent from getting his pieces off the board. And apparently it was a much slower game to play, but much more tactical and technical. And according to a lot of backgammon scholars, much more satisfying and fun to play. The other game we're going to look at, which is actually, I think, a fairly uniquely English game, is Nine Men's Morris, sometimes called Merrill's. And basically that is a game, it's a counter game, but you play it on a square board which is marked out with 3 concentrically smaller squares, each one joined by straight lines, and each point where the lines cross, it forms a node. And you have 24 nodes over the 3 squares, which basically gives you 8 points on each square. Now you take it in turns to place your markers on the board, either black or white going first. And the object is to form a line of 3. Each time you make a line of 3, you can remove one of your opponent's pieces. If you play the game well enough, you can win the game simply by building 3 lines of 3, at which point you have removed 3 of your opponent's pieces, which means that the best he can do is to create 2 lines of 3. Therefore you win 3-2. The other way you can win, you achieve that by removing your opponent's pieces by jumping them. But you have to jump into an empty space. And if you play the game correctly and tactically and intuitively, you can jump over spaces to create straight lines, at which point he can't touch that line. He can't break into a line if there's no gap in it. You keep playing, and once one player is down to 2 pieces and can no longer physically form a line of 3, you've won. Quite a tactical, interesting, intuitive game. I've played it a few times, long time ago. We used to play it as part of the living history side of the reenactment that I used to do, a long time ago. But it always drew a lot of interest. And it's one of those games that I can remember when I was a youngster, 18, 19-year-old. It was one of those games that was always in the pub, tucked away in the corner, with the darts, with the chessboard and the drafts and things like that. So it was always there to play, but you don't see it so much now, which I think is a shame. So that's the board games. Now the other games we're going to look at are stick and ball games. Now the first one is the origin game for our national sport, cricket, and it's called stool ball. Now as we go, I'll explain the similarities. If you watch a game of cricket, you will see that each end of the pitch there are 3 stumps driven into the ground. They represent the 3 legs on the stool that was used in stool ball. Across the top of the stumps are placed 2 wooden bales. Now a bale in medieval Old English is an area or an object which has to be protected. That was the job of a bailiff, whose area of influence was his bailiwick. So there's lots of different connections. So anyway, so the modern game, 3 stumps, 2 bales. The ancient game, 3-legged stool with a jug or a bucket placed on the stool. Now, in cricket, we have 2 batsmen playing in partnership in pairs. One batsman receives a ball from a bowler, hits the ball, and then they run, crossing paths with each other, swapping ends as needed, so that you can take it in terms of batting if you want to. The ancient game, again, 2 batsmen running from the stool to a fixed point, usually the doorway into the room, passing each other as you work up your runs. You're working in partnership to score runs or to score points. Now here's the difference though. In stool ball, there is no designated bowler. Anybody and everybody on the fielding team can, at any time, pick up the ball and throw it at the wicket. The wicket is what we're calling the stool with the bucket on it. And if they hit the bucket or the stool and knock the bucket off the stool or knock the whatever, if they hit it, the batsman running towards it is out. In the modern game of cricket, any of the fielders, after the ball has been played by the batsman, can throw the ball at the wicket comprising the 3 stumps and the bails in an attempt to get the batsman out. If the fielder hits the stumps before the batsman gets there, batsman's out, and a new batsman comes in and takes his place. Lots of similarities, but the differences are, and this is where the fun bit comes in, the modern game of cricket is quite slow because you've got to, once the batsmen stop running, you've got to slow the game down and then give the ball back to the bowler who bowls from a fixed position opposite the batsman, from the opposite end of the pitch to the batsman who was receiving. In stool ball, there's no such niceties available. Literally, the ball is in play all the time. So at any time, the ball can be picked up and thrown at the wicket. And if it hits the wicket, you're out. The batsman's job is to hit the ball so it doesn't hit the wicket. So he hits the ball away. Now he can run or not run. It's entirely up to him. But if he runs, his partner has to run as well. So they might end up swapping positions. Now here's where it gets fun. The first batsman hits the ball, he goes into the corner of the room because this was played indoors. The fielder picks up the ball and throws it back. The batsman running towards the wicket, towards the stool, sees the ball coming. He's got to make a judgment. Is that ball going to hit the stump? In which case, he's got to try and get there and knock the ball away. Now, he can run or not. It's up to him. But he's got to protect that wicket. He's got to protect the bucket and the stool. If he chooses to run, the guy at the other end has to run as well, because you can't have two at the same end. So you've got another situation where a fielder picks up the ball and throws it straight at the wicket. The batsman gets there, whacks it away, and they run again. Or he thinks to himself, he's going to miss. I am going to get another run. So you start running back again. So he gets there, the ball goes sailing past the wicket, misses by a few inches. The batsman shouts, run! So he turns around and runs back in time, hopefully, for his partner to get to the wicket in time to stop the ball hitting. If he doesn't, and the ball hits the stump, hits the stool or the bucket, or is touched by a fielder, just touching the ball to it, he's run out, he's out. Very exciting game. The original game doesn't get played very often, I wouldn't think. We had a game of it once at Warkworth Castle many, many years ago, and it was an absolute hoot. And we literally just played it in the castle grounds. We probably shouldn't have, but the castle custodians had gone home for the night. We were left to our own devices, actually camping in the castle, and we had a game of stool ball. And it was an absolute hoot. It was hilarious, great fun. Anyway, so that's the origins of cricket. Now, where does the name come from? We'll do a quick... No, I'll tell you what, we won't do the name. It's too long-winded. Suffice it to say, most of the people who will tell you where the name comes from haven't got a clue. If somebody asks you, come and see me. The next ball game we're going to look at, now this might throw the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit. It's the origins of the game of baseball. Now, people will tell you that it was a guy called Abner Doubleday who invented the game of baseball in America. I'm sorry, you guys, but he didn't. He codified a set of rules which is the modern game as it is played today. However, the rules that he codified were almost direct copies of a set of rules from a book called Ball Games for Boys, which was a series of books published in the late 1700s, early 1800s, with suggestions for young men and boys who
Wi-Fi
were
security. Scanning.
at home during the summer holidays from university and school and what have you, suggested ball games for them to play when they got home. Now, Abner codified his rules in 1839. The last edition to contain rules for baseball was published in 1800. The first ever game of baseball called baseball as such was played in 1730 in Surrey, using the first set of rules codified within well, it was based on, sorry, I got it the wrong way around. The rules for that game were then codified in the first ever edition of Ball Games for Boys, which was published in about 1750. So 20 years later. Now, the origins of the game are a game called Rounders. Now, the original game, again, it was a winter game played indoors. And the object of the game was to score points. You got a point each time one of the batting team made it all the way around all four bases and got back to what you Americans might call home plate. But it was a little bit different. Home plate was in the centre of usually the doorway into a banqueting hall. Sorry, we're getting lost again. Usually into the centre of a banqueting hall. And the bases were actually the corners of the room. So you would have two teams, a fielding team and a batting team. The fielding team would take positions, one on each corner, one in each base, and then there would be a few players placed around the room to catch or whatever, and a bowler. And the bowler would deliver the ball to the batsman. Now the batsman had to run. As soon as that ball was bowled, they either had to hit it, let it hit the wall behind them, but they had to run. And they had to run between the corner of the room and the fielding player in the corner. So they had to go in between the wall, corner and the player and go through four corners and get all the way back. They didn't have to do it all in one go. Just like baseball, you could run to what we will call first base, the first corner, and stop. But the next batsman up had to run, which means that you in the first corner had to run. Now if the second player, the way you could be got out was to be run out or caught. So the second player elects not to hit the ball, but run straight to first corner, to the first base. One of the fielders runs in, grabs the ball, sees that the second player has got it to the first corner, sees that you're not there, and throws the ball to the second corner. And the catcher, the fielder catches the ball before you get there, you're out. If you get there before the ball gets there, you're in. Just like baseball, the way you can throw it, like somebody's running to second base, you throw the ball to second base, they catch the ball before the player gets there, the player's out. If the player gets to second base before the ball, he's safe. Exactly the same rules. The only difference is you have to run, even if you don't hit the ball. There's no foul balls, there's no catcher behind you, there's just a wall or the door. And as soon as that ball is bowled, you can run. You don't have to wait for the ball to get to you. You can run straight away if you want to. The problem comes when, say, there's three of the bases are loaded. Yeah? You've got a player on first, on second, on third, and on fourth. All the person on fourth base has to do is get here. But you've got one batsman left. The ball's bowled, a fielder runs in, grabs the ball, touches the player running towards home plate. He's out. Game's over. Why? Because there's no more batsmen to push the men around the corners. You've got to have somebody moving onto home plate all the time. However, you could be the last player on the batting team, and if you can hit the ball into such a position or into such a way that the fielders can't really get at it quite easily, and if you can make it round all four corners of the room back to the batting position, you can bat again. And you can keep doing that until you're either caught out or run out. Great fun game. So there we have the origins of the game of baseball. Now there are lots of people who will try to tell you that it's an offshoot of cricket. It isn't. There's no connection at all. It's more like rounders than any other game. The only difference between rounders is that the hitting rule. In order to get a run, you've got to hit the ball. You can't run until, well, you can steal, can't you? You can bunt, you can steal. There are ways in baseball of running without hitting. So again, similarities. But the main difference is that the rounders court is square with the batting position in the middle of one of the straight edges of the square. The baseball, it's twisted. So the batting position becomes one of the bases, becomes one of the corners. And that's really the only real difference. Even in baseball, you still have that situation where it's possible you have 9 innings. So you could keep going and going and going, and you're constantly building up the score. Same with rounders. Anyway, just thought I found that interesting. And I thought you might as well. Now, I'm going to throw a little bonus in for you American guys. Now, I notice this all the time. You American guys, you mention something on one of your videos, or you mention it in a comment on somebody else's videos, you are always getting told off for calling football, as in our football, soccer. And there's always somebody will tell you off. Well, here's what to say to them. Tell them they don't know what they're talking about. Because the rest of the world calls football soccer. Now I'm going to tell you why. In the 1960s, the English Football Association, the FA, the governing body of association football, decided that they wanted to try and differentiate our football with all the other kinds of games that were out there. For instance, Gaelic or Irish football, rugby football, Australian rules football, American football. There were lots of different types of football, and the FA wanted to differentiate. So they took the word association and they threw some letters away and they played around with it and they came up with the word soccer. And that is what they tried to get English fans to call football. Now that caught on throughout the rest of the world. It didn't catch on in England because, as far as we're concerned, we've got nearly 1,000 years of history in the name football. Football has been played in England for nearly 1,000 years, and we refused point blank to start calling it soccer. And even to this day, even though the Football Association still insists on calling it soccer, the fans and the clubs don't, because it's the fans who make the game. They're the ones who pay the bills. They're the ones who go to the matches. They're the ones who can cause problems. So there we go. Just a little bonus thing thrown in there from English social history, a little bit more modern, just to make up for me sort of spoiling your notion about where the game of baseball comes from. Anyway, I hope you didn't find that too boring. I hope you found it interesting. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, guys.